Hey, everyone. Welcome to another episode of At the Table. I'm always pumped that you're joining me for another conversation. And especially in season 2, I am able to bring in some people that, goodness, I think are incredible leaders. They're incredible ministers, and I'm just doing so many cool things across the planet. And as we are walking through my book, The Calling of Eve, chapter 9, I know if you've already read it, you know it was my favorite chapter to write because I am all about justice, according to my counselor and therapist. And so it was really fun to be able to unpack the Hebrew midwives and Dorcas. And today I get to interview a new friend. I mean, we've kind of known each other from afar thanks to the internet and just being able to be kind of women leaders at the same time in the same moment. But today I get to ask her all the fun questions. So Bri Stensrud, did I say it right? Bri Stensrud.
You did it.
All right.
Great.
I feel like, yes, gold star. Glad
Part's over.
have you on the show today. I cannot wait for this conversation. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? Where are you recording from? Some of the get to know you questions.
Sure. My name is Bri Stensrud. I live in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and that's where I office out of as well. I've got 2 kids, an 11-year-old and a 5-year-old. And I've been married for 16 years. Maybe it's 15 or 16. I'm just not really great with dates. So if you're like me, I hope that my husband remembers the date, but it's around 16 years.
I feel like, especially after kids and then having to celebrate and keep up with like all of their dates of birth and, you know, their birthdays and everything, we just kind of stop counting. Like, it's just, hey, we're celebrating. We're here. We're still going.
Yes, exactly.
Well, you are a special treat, I think, in this episode, and specifically talking about women and justice and compassion ministries, because, man, this is such a heartbeat of yours. And you are leading in some incredible ways, and God is opening up doors for you and just through your obedience. So why don't you tell me a little bit about Women in Welcome and how it got started and how really, I want to kind of go back to the beginning of how did this stirring kind of happen in your heart, and what did God kind of birth within you? Where did it start? Was it in seminary? Was it just in conversation, in coffee? Like, tell me, how did this thing get birthed?
Well, I think I have to start back. I grew up in the church. I'm a pastor's kid. My dad is an evangelical free church pastor. And so I grew up in a home that was very welcoming of people from various parts of the world. We were very involved in missions and missions trips and all these things. And so even though I lived in the Midwest, I grew up in the Midwest, very conservative family, very conservative environment and community. We always had a lot of diversity of people in and out of our homes. And I think that was a really wonderful gift from my parents and just from the Lord, as far as being exposed to so many different people. And also just as being in the church, you're just exposed to different people from different walks of life. And that was just really important to see all the time. So I think that kind of shaped me as a young kid. But then I really got involved in the pro-life movement after I went to seminary and whatnot. I wanted to teach the Bible. And at the time, there wasn't really anything opening up for me in that space. And I got involved in the pro-life movement and was really, at the time, traveling around the country, talking about the violence of abortion and just the complexities of abortion and the compassion that was needed for vulnerable women, and really just kind of the life-sustaining care that women needed post-birth. And then, of course, that led me into adoption and foster care world. And I started going around the country with Focus on the Family, talking about the needs of vulnerable children in all of our communities, the hidden orphans that were modern day orphans here in our community. So I was recruiting families for kids in foster care, and I ended up going down the adoption journey ourselves. My family did. And in the middle of all of that, I got a call from World Relief asking me if I wanted to go across the border to engage kind of in the immigration conversation. And at the time, it was really during the height of the previous administration, which was the Trump administration. And there was just a lot of heightened rhetoric, a lot of inflamed rhetoric about immigrants and refugees. And for the first time ever, I think immigrants who are mostly kind of migrating up, what people traditionally thought of migrants migrating up from the South, from Mexico, Central and South America, and refugees who were coming from overseas were being lumped together in the same conversation, and it wasn't a positive conversation. And so in my work in the pro-life space, a lot of what I was working on doing was really expanding the traditional sense of what it meant to be pro-life from a biblical perspective. So if we care about the dignity and sanctity of every human life, what are the verses that anchor us and give us confidence to use our voice well for the vulnerable in the womb? And it was that we were all created in the image and likeness of God, that Jesus formed us in our wombs, that he cares about our flourishing, that he has a plan for our lives, that we are to speak up for those who can't speak for themselves, and that we are to pay attention to the destitute and the vulnerable and the migrant and the sojourner and the orphan. So all these verses that really kind of anchored me in this kind of traditional pro-life sense were really expanding my worldview when it came to being holistically pro-life, really from womb to tomb. And so when I got this invite from World Relief to go across the border for 4 days on an immersion trip to really understand what were the migration dynamics and really push and pull factors going on just in our southern region, that just right up next to the US, I just jumped at the chance. I knew it was going to be a hard trip, and I knew it was going to be a really worldview changing kind of trip, because anytime you get close, we all know that getting, proximate to things is very powerful, and it makes things very personal very quickly. I guess I drastically underestimated the life-changing heart shift that God would make in my life. And I went from really just doing kind of content creation and marketing and traditional pro-life, whole life pro-life conversations to, wow, this is a huge area of the pro-life worldview this is a piece of the puzzle that needs to be fit in, but it feels very wonky. Like immigration kind of feels like this very progressive, untouchable conversation. And at the time, it was very much co-opted by partisan narratives.
Yeah.
And the narratives that were really circulating in conservative evangelicals kind of echo chambers was really starting to get discouraging. I think that a lot of us kind of felt like we're hearing this on the news and we're seeing imagery on the news that's frightening to us. And then we're hearing our leadership use this kind of language to describe some of the elements that we're seeing. And we started easily kind of drifting towards that really negative stereotype. And so back in 2015, Lifeway Research out of Nashville, they did a study they partnered with World Relief, who is one of our country's resettlement agencies for refugees. And they, evangelical entity, they're the official humanitarian arm of the National Association of Evangelicals. So they had a really big stake in humanitarian work and what evangelicals were thinking and saying and feeling about some of the world's most vulnerable people that were coming to our border and also looking to come from overseas. So they commissioned Lifeway to do this study. Like, how bad is it? Is the rhetoric that's so inflamed, is it really affecting how evangelicals think about immigrants and refugees? And the research came back, and sadly, it was really dismaying. And it was, the big takeaways is that pastors were not preaching about this issue. People were not being discipled on it. When asked what was your biggest influence about how you thought about immigrants and refugees, the Bible was listed. And yet, anytime the Bible's listed, it's probably the right answer on a survey. And yet media and partisan platforms were the top influence of people's perspective and their influence on what they thought about immigrants and refugees. So that was just super dismaying. And the Bible was pretty low. Only 12% of evangelicals considered the Bible their number one influence on how they thought about this vulnerable population. So that was really hard to take, right? But the interesting thing, and I love about women and women in ministry, women who love Jesus, is that when they parsed out men from women in that evangelical research, women had higher levels of compassion and empathy towards vulnerable immigrants and refugees, particularly mothers who were showing up at the border with their kids and not knowing where to go, and mothers who were languishing in refugee camps and whatnot. And so the question was, Okay, so we see higher levels of compassion and a desire to show hospitality with women. Probably because we have a gazillion Bible studies on hospitality in
Right.
our ministry world. Um, they said, is anyone talking to them about immigrants and refugees? How's that going? And do they actually really exist? Sometimes research is a little funky, right? So um, what they did is they put together a Bible study. World Relief commissioned some folks at CT to help them put together a Bible study in partnership with another organization called the National Immigration Forum. And what they did is they put out this Bible study. It's called Ruth and Naomi. It was basically like immigration kind of 101, and using just this very familiar story that we should revisit with just some fresh perspective and some fresh eyes, since the immigration narrative was everywhere, and how both of those women were or became immigrants. And usually focus that story on that it's just such a love story,
Mhm.
and yet this story that we keep retelling and we love and we write Bible studies on and we do sermons on, is the two main characters are immigrants who had to migrate off of survival. And so they put out this Bible study, and they just had thousands of women downloading this Bible study. Today there's been over 135,000 downloads of that study.
Wow.
So just that particular one, and we have other ones. But in any case, I was invited down to Oaxaca, Mexico, to kind of experience this. And then when I got back, this kind of project was already kind of starting. This welcome work was already kind of starting. And when I got back from my trip, I was just wrecked.
Okay, so you probably don't know this about me, but so my family, my mom, they were some of the first Cuban refugees in the 60s that was brought over by the Texas Baptist. And so I think you're right, just in the proximity conversation. And it's so easy, especially, and we'll get to this here in a little bit, but it's been so politicized that whenever you actually have somebody sitting in front of you my whole life changed because of that decision of them to be able to come over and the opportunities. And I even got to go back to Cuba last year and to see my family there. And so it was a hard reality of just how different our lives looked because of one decision and because of the opportunity that was then waiting kind of on the other side of that decision. So take me to the border, because I know that was such an influential time for you and your first trip. And now really you're inviting women to have that same experience. So take us to the border and maybe some of the stories that you're seeing with moms holding their babies and after a long journey and being separated within families. Like, maybe tell us a little bit about just some of the hard struggle that we don't see or hear about because we're not face to face with them.
Sure, yeah. So my very first trip, I was asked to go to southern Mexico for 4 days. And on that trip, um, I found myself crying, sobbing, in a storage closet in a children's shelter run by the Mexican government. After a story that I had heard, after coming face to face with two really young girls in the shelter. There was an 11-year-old and there was a 13-year-old. And my friend Heather McFadden and she was on the trip with me. We were engaging with these two young girls, and they were both holding babies. And so there was a lot of children around, a lot of, little people and everything just running around. And so we were asking the translators, okay, so who are they? Where are they from? Why are they here? And whose babies are these, and all this. And as we were getting the story back in translation, it kind of felt like a slow-mo movie. Like Heather and I were just, we had no words, finding out that these two girls, these were their babies, an 11-year-old and a 13-year-old. And these were their babies. So you had babies holding babies. This happened 5-6 years ago. It still makes me incredibly emotional, because at the time I had a young, 6, 7, 8-year-old daughter at home. And, I showed up really to the shelter thinking, who loses track of their child? Like, we're showing up to a center that's run just for children, and they'd either been lost by their parents, gotten separated somehow, or they had been left there by their parents. And I just kind of showed up with a lot of judgment, like, who does that?
Mm.
Who leaves their child to continue on to the American dream without your kids? And just come to find out, the complexities involved. And really my question went from who could do this and why would you, to wow, this was the best option.
Mm.
As terrible as this option is, this is the best option. And here's why. And so over the course of the 4 days, I just learned about how these young girls were violated in their home countries and their mothers left with them. And along the way, they're going to deliver.
Mhm.
And what are you going to do when you're walking through the desert and you don't have your community and you have little funds, and of course, you're coming in a caravan because you're coming with a large share of people for protection, because 80 to 90% of women who make this journey to the US are sexually assaulted along the way by gang members or other migrants. So it's just, you start to realize like these mothers were doing the best that they could to get their kids out of that situation. And then when it just became untenable, you're just putting one foot in front of the other. When it became untenable, there was, thank God, a government shelter for your kids that would provide health care when your daughter would deliver, that would feed the baby and your daughter, that would house her until she's 18 or whenever you needed, so that you could get to the US and she wouldn't have to endure the journey with a brand new baby. And you would send for her.
Mm.
And it really just highlighted how so much of our American privilege blindsides us to the real disparity that exists for people
Mhm.
who are south of our border.
Mhm.
And so that was the story that just kind of changed a lot for me. And then we learned just about kind of the regional dynamics and whatnot. And so nowadays, I'm directing this project, Women of Welcome. So when I came back from that trip, I was asked if we're starting this project. We know that there are evangelical women who are out there who have compassion, but no one's talking to them. We put out this Bible study. It's been a real success, but we don't know where to take this and what to do. And would you kind of direct this project? And that was a very overwhelming thing to think about, because I was so green. I just come off my first immersion trip. What do you mean? And really what it did, what the Lord did, was it allowed me to go on an authentic journey with the women who I was asking to come into this space. And so I had a lot of fears still. I had a lot of questions still. I didn't know all the policy jargon. I didn't know. And at that time, I was as green as they come. And I knew one thing is that immigrants were made in the image and likeness of God, and that truth made that fit into my pro-life worldview. And so I was like, how do I fit it into the puzzle? How do I communicate that? And then how do I bring other women along? And really, it's just been an authentic journey myself with other women, thousands and thousands of other women who want to get into this space too. So now I lead trips down to the southern border, and we don't go into southern Mexico, but we go to Tijuana and San Diego area. We go to El Paso and Ciudad Juarez, and we visit shelters. We visit maternity shelters. We visit pastors who have turned their churches into shelters. We visit the wall. So it's just so weird to see the wall on the news and pictures of it. And you think, oh, I'm so glad we have a wall. And yet when you get there and you can see people through the wall, and you could reach your hand through and you can touch them and you can ask them about their lives and what their hopes and dreams are, it changes a lot for you. And I think one of the things that women are most afraid of when they hear about talking about immigration or the border or security or whatever is that they think that this is a either or conversation. And honestly, the relief that I hope you hear is that this is a both and. So of course, I want safe and secure borders, 100%. Like at this day and age, it's not responsible of our government to not know what's coming across the border, what's coming in and out of the country. It's not responsible to not vet people who are seeking asylum and safety and refuge in our country. That's irresponsible if we didn't know those things. But a wall with no doors is a prison. I had a community member who came on a trip, and she said that we were standing at the wall and we were staring at the wall. And she said, you know what just occurred to me is that a wall with no doors is a prison. And I think, one of the biggest things we say at Women of Welcome is that we can have safe and secure borders, and we can have compassionate treatment of people made in the image of God.
Mhm.
And what that really means is that you can have safe and secure borders, but we also need functioning legal pathways for people to be able to flourish. And
Mhm.
right now we haven't had major immigration reform since the 1980s. And what everybody thinks is that the president really controls what happens on immigration. And sure, he can write some temporary executive orders that really can cause some havoc down at the border and create some really clickable headlines. But really the hard work is that Congress has to make some immigration reforms. And that's a lot harder work. So yes, we take people down there, and you can sign up on our website to go on a trip with us. Those are things that we do.
Okay, so I didn't know it's been since the 1980s that there has been immigration reform. And clearly, like our world is so different
So different.
from the 1980s than to today. So, and I think it's so interesting, I think, as a leader to kind of hear your story, because this obviously wasn't something that you set in or that you went to school for or tried to get training
No,
in. Like I love hearing how your passions and even from a young age, how God has just pieced together this beautiful heart to love people and to fight for people, for them to know that they are loved and seen by God. So now, though, I have watched you really trying to kind of step into that, not political realm, but trying to really push for some of that reformation happening within our immigration processes and systems. So, how would you say, like, how do we coach us in how to even talk about this? Because I think for most people that are not in the trenches of it, it is very much a political conversation. And I love how you brought up, like, this is a Bible issue. This is not hospitality means doilies and pretty place settings. Like this is literally what the Bible teaches about welcoming people and loving people and meeting needs. And so kind of talk us through, how do we approach this conversation that seems to be so polarizing, in the idea of this is something that every Christian, every believer that has been touched by grace, redeemed by God, that we're kind of charged to be working this thing out. We need to be loving people. We need to be extending grace and help to everyone that's made in the image of God, literally everyone. So kind of coach us through, how do we engage this conversation? Where do we start? Where do we maybe have some landmines that we're trying to miss? Or if we are in the middle of landmines, what do we say? Like, how do we kind of redirect the conversation to the heart of the matter?
I think first and foremost, we have to be aware of what is influencing the way that we think about other people.
Mhm.
So in that survey that I talked about, media was the number one thing that was influencing people. And yet we knew Bible was the right answer. Click
Right.
C, please. But that was not what people clicked on. So I think being really attuned to what is influencing how you think about another person that you may or may not
That's good.
know.
Yeah.
I think when we are attuned to that, we start to understand what narratives are being created and given to us instead of the narrative that the scriptures give us.
Mhm.
So, I mean, when you look at the scriptures from the get go, from the very jump, even Adam and Eve, they were the first people to migrate out of the garden. But when you think about Abram and how he was asked to go, and he wasn't really told exactly what was going to happen or where he was going to go and all of these things, but it was for his flourishing. Every major biblical character was touched by migration or was an immigrant, or was asked to go somewhere and travel somewhere away from their home or be a part of a different community or a different culture in order for the carrying forward of God's people and the flourishing of his people, or for the carrying forward of the gospel and the mission of Christ.
Mhm.
And so I never read my Bible that way because I'm a white European immigrant, like I don't think about my history in that way. And so when I read the Bible, I'm reading them from white Western eyes.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so I've missed those elements that other people around the world, the broader church, global church really cling to for survival. Like I don't know if it's a privilege or a curse to not be able to look and read your Bible and see those elements and say, I resonate with that because they talked about the famine. I resonated with that because she had to go leave everything she ever knew and go here. I resonate with that because I felt like I knew my life was at stake, or my family member was killed in front of me. Like most of us have never ever even had to read scriptures and consider that as part of our context in how we interpret scripture. A lot of our scripture can be just kind of like written on a mug and helps us through like a really hard day, and I'm not downplaying the struggles Americans have at all. I'm just saying it's a different level of context and it's a different level of awareness that I didn't grow up with. I was told to love God and love people. And somehow loving certain groups of people became very controversial. I remember the very first time I started kind of posting about immigrants and refugees in a different way. Not that I wasn't doing it in a dignified way before, but it just wasn't super outspoken about it, right? And so I started talking about it, and all of a sudden there were whispers from girls in my Bible study, and there were whispers from friends that I would go on walks with. Have you seen what Bri is posting? I mean, she's like, is she gone liberal? Like, what happened? Is she for open borders now? I know. And instead of coming and talking to me, it was kind of like there was this kind of undercurrent of like, is Bri still with us? Because she's talking about immigrants and refugees in a different way, which was really hurtful to me. And then I was like, and this is how we get there. We are not attuned to what's influencing how we think about other people. And we're not close enough to those very people to have a different personal experience because we're lacking proximity, right? So I think being attuned to that and being aware of the narrative that's being created for you and given to you, apart from what's being told in the scriptures, which, in the Old Testament, the Old Testament highlights really 4 vulnerable populations that are, kind of grouped together and talked about more than any other populations: the orphan, the widow, the sojourner, and the poor. They're usually lumped together, or they're highlighted more than anybody else. Not preborn children, not those in human trafficking and slavery, no, it's the poor, the sojourner, the widow, and the orphan. It's so interesting. Like, I didn't know that before, but they're mentioned more than they're elevated. If any population was to be elevated in taking care of them, it was those. And then in the New Testament, you see Jesus in Matthew 25, and he's just like, when you see people hungry, when you see them thirsty, when you see them naked, when you see them sojourning, when you see them, it's like, that's me. So when you see people like that and you minister to people, like, you're actually ministering to me. And when you ignore them, you're actually ignoring me. And I'm not going to recognize you. I'm going to separate the sheep from the goats. And I'm going to know based off of how you interacted with other people. And so without even knowing it, we've either demonized or we've discounted an entire group of people without even actually being close to them. And I think that that's a really hard thing for women when, you start to speak up and you say things that are very true, like immigrants and refugees are made in the image and likeness of God. That should not be a controversial statement. But it does pique people's curiosity, like, oh boy, she's on a slippery slope there. What does that mean when she says that? It means exactly what I said it means. And it also means that all of the things that anchor us in other areas, like the preborn space, like adoption, like, foster care, like human trafficking, and like poverty missions, elderly care, like this group, vulnerable population of people, fits in that. It's like, love God, love others. Everybody's in the others category, and compassion should not be controversial.
Right. Yes.
So I think it's hard to find your footing, but if you revisit scripture, hopefully what that does and what it should do, and the work that we do at Women of Welcome, is really attaching confidence to your compassion. As a Christian woman, I know you have compassion for people that are hurting. It's about having the confidence in this crazy politically saturated country we live in, right? To be able to have courage and confidence to speak up and say something different.
Mhm.
And not have how you think about things and how you talk about things co-opted by a partisan narrative. Because I know this is going to be hard to hear, but you can't find America first in the Bible.
Mhm. Yeah.
That's probably a very controversial thing to say, but I mean, that does not mean I'm for open borders. That does not mean everybody should be here that wants to be here. That does not mean that we don't take following laws seriously. What that means is what that means is we have to face the reality of what God says is true about people, and then what we're called to do for people. Walk humbly, seek out mercy and justice. And those are things that actually require something of us. So you can't be laid back about that. And so saying things that are true should not be hard for Christians.
Mhm.
And so the work at Women of Welcome is simply just trying to attach confidence to your compassion.
I appreciate you saying so much of what you just did. And you probably are stepping on my toes too. But even as you're
Sorry.
saying it, it's good. And it's so easy for us, especially in the West, especially here in America, because of how much is at our fingertips, that it's easy to get into these rhythms of only seeing our things through our lens. And what you're calling us to do is to be uncomfortable. What you're calling us to do is maybe to not walk in fear, which I think so many of these conversations, especially politically around immigration and refugees, is the fear of what could happen or what will happen if, something ends up happening. And so I love that you're calling us back to the core truth of everyone needs to be loved. Everyone needs to be seen the way that God sees them. And the absolute missional opportunity to be able to look someone in the eye and tell them in the midst of some of the darkest, most hard months, years of their lives. And in that moment, in that need, being able to point them to the God that is pursuing them and chasing them. And I keep thinking back to your Ruth and Naomi comment, because I remember I taught on the genealogy in Matthew 1 and talking about Ruth and her as a refugee, and the women just looking at me like so confused, like, wait a second, what? And like,
I
just
know we don't read it
eyeballs,
like that.
of like, and so when you actually are reading your Bible through this lens of seeing God's chase, and I know I've said it on this podcast so many times, but how kind and good he is from the garden to today to find us, to come after us and be able to, in the midst of all of our junk and all of the hard, show his grace and compassion and redemption toward us. And so being an extension of that to people made in the image of God is such an incredible privilege that I think probably, I don't want to say lazy, because I don't think everybody's there, but I think just because we are so busy and consumed with our own lives and our own safety and our own comfort and the way that things just kind of play out for us, that they don't even come to mind. Like it's not even
Well, you
a
have to address people's fears. You have to do that, because it's really insincere to have this conversation without acknowledging what we fear. We
Mm,
fear culture change. We fear all the narratives about gang violence. We fear things. We fear people that look different, sound different, come from different places. So instead of just saying that's not relevant, it
mm,
is. It's
mhm.
relevant to the conversation. Let's have the conversation, and let's not be afraid of showing up in a messy way. At Women of Welcome, we say that you can show up messy, but we won't leave you that way. So you show up with a question that maybe may actually be racist, but you don't know it, or may actually be really dehumanizing. But that's the language that you've been given, right? And
Mhm.
so, how do we have better conversations that are more humanizing and more Christ-like? And honestly, where all of this starts is with Christ-like welcome. It starts with welcome, and sometimes that's a choice. It's a choice to welcome like Christ does, because one of the things that we do, it's one of my favorite parts of our immersion trips that we take to the border, is we have devotion time at the wall where we have communion, and we really spend time thinking about what is the welcome that Christ extended to us. What is Christ-like welcome? Well, what it is it's something that came for us.
Mm,
It's something that sought us out. It's something that didn't clobber us over the head, but that like wooed us and It fed us, it gave us a cold cup of water. And where would we be if Christ did not seek us out? And if the welcome of Christ towards us cost him his life, and we are to be like him, why would we not think that our welcome shouldn't cost us something and cost us something big? And so when I think about, hey, whenever it gets foggy and you're confused and you've got a lot of things coming at you about this vulnerable population and about this subject matter, I want you just to revisit how complicated and how messy and yet how persistent the welcome of Christ was for you. There was a pathway made for you, and it was rough, but it was holy, and it was intentional, and it pulled you out of things that your life could have gone into, that you could have gone into. It puts you into things for your flourishing. And so when Jesus says, I want you to love your neighbor as yourself, what does that look like? Could you see yourself on the other side of the border? Could you see yourself languishing for an average of 15 years in a refugee camp with your family and no one coming for you? No one advocating for your flourishing, for your family? And you hearing about the strongest nation in the world who holds to Christian values and morals, and yet there is no welcome mat for you at the border, and there is no one coming for you in the refugee camp. You don't have a voice in there, and yet you've got a lot of Christians in the strongest, most powerful nation of the world who are not lifting up their voices for you, and yet they're commanded to do so in the Bible. Let me tell you something that's just so interesting, that was really faith altering for me. As I was in a shelter in Juarez, Mexico, and there were just a ton of flags on the wall, and I was like, this is a lot of flags. What's going on here? And he said, this flag represents someone who's come from that nation through our shelter. And you had African flags, you had flags from the Caribbean, Central and South America. You had this one shelter, had over 36 nations come through their shelter to come to the US southern border. So while the US is really busy, the church is really busy sending missionaries to the far ends of the earth, and we should be, the nations are at our doorstep. They are begging to come see us, and they want to be a part of our communities, and they want their children to flourish. They want to find safety. And so you have this opportunity where these folks coming from all over the world are incredibly vulnerable, and they are looking for a cold drink, and they're looking for safe haven. And yet we are so like, oh, the mission is out there. No, the mission is at our southern border. The nations are at our southern border. And I personally have really become convicted that the revival that we keep praying for in this country, we're like, oh Lord, bring up our children, bring up our churches, do all these. It's like, how do we think God is going to bring revival if nothing changes for us in our day-to-day routine, how we raise our kids, what we do? Yeah, we can shelter and protect, and we can do these things. What about doing the work of Christ like welcome, where we're inviting people into our communities and into our homes that make us think about people different, that stretch us financially, that stretch us spiritually and emotionally and culturally? Like, this is what Jesus did. He had this table and said, I'm going to eat with these people, and it's going to cost me my reputation. It's going to cost me probably some followers. It's going to cost me part of my ministry, credibility. And yet this is the work that my Father sent me to do. This is what he sent me to do. And so my table is going to get longer. My wall is not going to get higher. And so when I think about how revival could be just building on the southern side of our border, and if we would get involved in bringing and helping assimilate and welcome people into this country, I think the revival is coming from the immigrant population. I think that's what's going to revive the church. And yet right now, I feel like the church is like, we're going to kind of stir up our own revival in our own spaces. based off of all of the right theological note cards we have in our kids' backpacks, and based off of the churches that we attend, and all of the things. It's like, I'm not convinced that that's going to do it, but I also see that God is just, what he's doing is he's bringing the nations to us. And if you read the book of Obadiah, there are some very strong convictions from the Lord about how the people in that book of the Bible, where the Edomites, they criticized and they mocked and they ignored the plight of those who were being carted through the valleys of their country. And instead of coming to their aid, they stood aloof, is what the scripture said. And therefore Jesus said, I will bring you down. I'm just wondering when the Lord is going to be fed up with our indifference to the suffering of others who are sojourning and needing to sojourn in our land, and how we feel like we're kind of this untouchable nation. And the Lord is like, I will level you for your lack of love for other people, because I love these people. And it might be hard to talk about, but guess what? That's what you're here to do. To cause holy havoc in these really safe and curated spaces. Engage the fear, acknowledge it, lean in, find the answers. I guarantee you Women of Welcome has probably done a video or answered all of these questions from really great people like Dr. Russell Moore and Matthew Sorens and Jenny Yang, and just a host of authors and theologians and speakers. We've just like, any question, because I've gone on this journey myself. I'm still on a journey. I'm like, I need to know the answer to this. Are you secretly for open borders? Like, what do we do about culture change? What about Romans 13? What about, like, I went to seminary. So I'm like, yeah, I need the jot and tittle. I need all the things here, please. And so I guarantee you we've probably answered the question. And if we haven't, let's have that conversation. I'm ready. Let's do it.
Yeah, I love it. Well, and I love that we're even getting to just have the conversation here, and even the discomfort, or maybe the, wait a second, what does she mean by that, is like really the nudge of keep going, keep trying to figure this thing out, keep asking those questions. And I think so often we get into some of these uncomfortable topics, or we don't feel like we know the answer to it, and we will just shrink back and just avoid. And so I love just your illustration of engaging the heart, engaging the conversation. And I know specifically you're talking about the borders, but I even want to go further than that. Like, they are in our communities. I mean, in our little suburb that we lived in Dallas, our neighbor was a refugee from Sudan, and she had been in a refugee camp with her family before moving here. Next door neighbor, and their kids came over. And so I think after this conversation, I really hope that there would just be the challenge of opening your eyes and being a little bit slower to the people that are around you and the people that are different. And then even taking one more step of, hey, how do you start a conversation and just say hello and get to know them and get to know their story and see how, like, God absolutely uses these moments, I think, to change them and to minister to them and love them. But even more so, there is so much change that happens in my own heart. I think whenever I engage that awkward and I step into the unknown and the fear and not knowing, and just trust that God has flourishing for both of us, as different as we are, to point us more to him. So Bri, I appreciate you so much. I appreciate just your courage and your strength and resilience to really step into a hard topic and appreciate it so much. So really quickly, why don't you tell us, how do people connect with you? How do they maybe join you on one of these trips? Kind of give us the quick lowdown of how they're able to become a part of Women of Welcome.
Sure. So Women of Welcome is on Facebook. It's also on Instagram. And then we also have a YouTube channel you can subscribe to as well. So any video that we do on any of social, we'll upload that to our YouTube channel. It's kind of like a library of all the things. There's some really great documentaries that we've done with Heather McFadden and Latasha Morrison on there. And there's some great videos from, like I said, some pastors and authors and theologians that just answer some of these really hard and complicated questions. I'm also on Instagram too, but if you're really wanting to engage in the immigration conversation, Women of Welcome is really where it's at. There is a private group. So if you're like, okay, I got to check this out. I might be a little wallflower for a while, which is great, which is fine. We have a private Facebook group, and that is a place where women who, it's a smaller subset of women who want to ask questions and need to show up just kind of where they are. And so they might ask a question in a weird way, or it might seem really elementary or silly to ask. That is a place, that is a community of women who are on a journey to have better conversations. And that is a place where you're not going to get trolled. You're not going to be judged. You're not going to be thought of in a different way. It's a lot of sharing, and it's a lot of question asking. Have you seen this? What do we do about this? I heard someone say this. I've got a refugee that someone, I heard of this, that, or the other. Does anyone know where I could get a resource or a recommendation or whatever? So it's just like a smaller, 5,000 people. It's not small. It's like a smaller family of where it's a protected space to show up and start asking questions. And that's where I would recommend that you would go. But you can follow us in all those places. So I do have a book that's coming out in the spring of 2024. It's called Start with Welcome, a journey towards a more compassionate and confident conversation about immigration. And then, of course, Dan Darling is a friend of mine, and he and I put together kind of a whole life, pro-life kids book. It's called The Biggest Best Light. And you can get that Amazon Christian book, wherever you buy books. So that's, I think, where you can follow along. womenofwelcome.com is the website where you can sign up on our menu, our heading there. You can click on trips and you can apply to come on one of our future trips.
Awesome. I love it. Well, we will make sure to put all of those links in the show notes, and that book, my boys love that book. And we've already talked before we started and hit record that we are going to have you back and have all the conversations specifically around immigration and your new book and all of those things. So I can't wait for our next round of conversations and questions.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. This was
so
fun.
much. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, I know, goodness, I hope you listen back to this episode, and I hope you maybe even gather a group of women around you to listen together and dialogue about it and start having those conversations, because God is doing so much through the compassion of women. And so I hope you go. I hope you are sent even after listening to this episode, but we are so thankful for you, and we will see you next time for another episode of At the Table. See you then.